What do you think of when you hear the word autism? That was the first question we asked people to answer in a survey I helped run earlier this year. If you asked me that question when I was younger, I probably would have thought of silent, helpless children. That was the only image I ever saw in the news or in charity advertisements. A sad, lonely child with his head in his knees and imprisoned in a glass cage. I don't believe that now. I grew up and I learned. Looking at the survey results though, I was struck by how familiar many of the responses felt. Echoes of the same images I used to carry. It reminded me that while understanding of autism has improved in many ways, some outdated views continue to linger. Based on people's answers to that first question we asked and a number of other questions, we sorted the replies into 3 general categories. Let's go through the positive one first. One of the categories we noticed was what we dubbed the neurodiversity category. People holding this view usually described autistic people as having a set of unique challenges as opposed to having an illness, and they generally wrote about them with more respect. They tended to describe autistic traits neutrally and often focused on external challenges faced by autistic people, such as discrimination, ostracization, and lack of support. Another sentiment that we found was the polar opposite. Autism was viewed as an insurmountable tragedy, and words such as suffering or helpless came up often. In these responses, autistic people were dehumanized, sometimes viewed only as a burden to their families, without any capacity for independent thought or even emotion of their own beyond constant pain. The most common view of our respondents, however, lay somewhere in the middle of these two. Autistic people weren't seen solely as a burden to their families, nor were they seen as fully regular people. Instead, they're simply seen as other, as strange, as different. Sometimes they were thought to be once-in-a-generation oddball geniuses. Most of the time, they were seen as the poor kid of some colleague who couldn't go to school. Most people expressed compassion or pity. Some expressed disturbance or even fear, but one thing remained constant across these replies. Autistic people weren't seen as equal. This picture is incredibly common, but it also leaves out a lot. The biggest issue here is invisibility. 2 groups in particular are often left out of the public imagination. First, where are the so-called high-functioning autistic people, or the more appropriate term, lower support needs autistic people? We know now that a significant portion of autistic people don't have intellectual disability, and many don't even realize they're autistic until they're well into adulthood. So why are they almost invisible from our public consciousness? Part of the reason may be that clinical systems where we live have not yet fully adopted new classification systems. Even though both the ICD and the DSM have revised their diagnostic criteria to include Asperger's syndrome under the broader spectrum of, well, autism spectrum disorder, Asperger's is still a distinct diagnosis in China, and it's usually used for people with higher intelligence and symptoms that are thought of as less severe. It's possible that people may think that lower support needs autistic people are classified under Asperger's, and therefore only think of lower functioning or higher support needs autistic people when asked to write about autism. However, given that some of the responses directly refer to Asperger's syndrome, most people likely do think of both classifications when they are prompted about autism. The strongest contributing factor for this invisibility is more likely the lack of awareness and education about lower support needs autistic people. Like I said in the beginning, most advertisements and information campaigns and even the news I came into contact with only depicted severely disabled children, and it seems like that hasn't changed over the years. I didn't know that autistic people could lead normal lives or that there was statistically at least one autistic person in every class I ever took, and I've never even noticed. It's undeniable that many autistic people need significant support in daily life and that their families often face significant financial and emotional burdens. I don't want to overlook the lived experiences and challenges they encounter. However, when their story is the only one that we tell, the needs and challenges of lower support needs autistic people are ignored, and that can also have significant consequences. Autistic people often suffer from bullying and from the constant pressure of conforming to a society of neurotypical people, who often see them as different or weird. It's well known that autistic people face a higher risk of mental disorders such as depression and anxiety. Part of that may be neurobiological, but it's also clear that the external challenges of living in an often unwelcoming society play a major role. Without the awareness that autism isn't always obvious, many autistic people will go undetected. Undiagnosed autistic people often spend their lives questioning why they're so different from everybody else, and why they can't just be normal. In fact, the reason many autistic adults seek diagnoses isn't because they expect a treatment or a cure, rather because they want to find an explanation for why they are the way they are. When we were reading through the survey answers, our team noticed another recurring pattern in the way some respondents described autistic people. Some associated them with characters like the Little Prince, or used the popular phrase children of the stars. Even more used words such as naive or pure, innocent, childish, even cute. Noticing a trend here? In fact, in about 10% of our answers, autistic people were described almost entirely in this infantilizing way. Obviously, this sort of misconception or stigma is its own problem. When you infantilize an entire group of people, their capacity for independence and ability is often denied, which can lead to a denial of autonomy. But in addition to that, there's another issue. Several respondents spoke only of autistic children, despite being asked about autistic people in general. So this is the second kind of invisibility, autistic adults being frozen in time as eternal children. This, sadly, isn't surprising. If you search for the word autism in Chinese, the same image almost always comes up: a child in some dejected state. Emphasis on child. When people in my school talked about volunteering or raising money for autistic people, it was always for an intervention center for autistic children, or to help families send their children there. Even in the popular phrase children of the stars, autistic people are still locked into that image of childhood. It's as if autistic people never grow up. They somehow become normal after their 18th birthday, taking off the hat, as some parents call it, successfully curing their child of autism somehow. Never seen or heard from again. They vanish from public consciousness, replaced by a new set of poor autistic children once they age out of the range of public sympathy. After that, well, who knows? Everyone is always concerned about what will happen to autistic people after their parents are gone, but we very rarely see stories of where these autistic people actually end up once they grow up. To be clear, I don't fault anyone for having a warped view of autism. It's a fact of life that we believe what we are shown, and what we are often shown about autism is that it's a tragedy. It only happens to children, and autistic people can't ever be normal. But the fact remains that reality isn't like this. Autism isn't a childhood disorder. It's a lifelong condition that can mean many different things to different autistic people. We can't just sit around waiting for some medical miracle to come and make autism disappear. In fact, many autistic people are strongly opposed to the idea of a cure. To them, autism is an inseparable part of their identity. Without it, they wouldn't be the same person. So, what can we do? Not every challenge autistic people face can be solved by medical approaches, but they can be eased by understanding, by acceptance, and by support. And while most of us may not have the power to change policies or donate millions, all of us can stay informed. If you know an autistic person, listen to them. If you don't, read from reliable sources. Share what you learn. Learn how to accommodate the needs of autistic people, and don't treat people differently just because they seem weird. And frankly, you shouldn't be doing that to anyone. Extend to autistic people, whether they need high or low levels of support, the same respect you would to anybody else. Because autistic people don't need pity. First, they need visibility. And ultimately, they need equality.